Welcome back, guys. From the moment that I bought the C6, and every time I look at it or drive it, I find myself constantly comparing it to the C5 that I've gotten to know so well these past 9 years. It is becoming undeniably clear to me that the C6 is closer to the C5 than any other 2 generations of Corvettes to date. In fact, some people even call the C6 the C5 and a half, and I absolutely get that. So in this video, we're going to go through the top 10 or so differences that have hit me these past 3 weeks as I've been driving the C6 and occasionally driving the C5. Let's start off with the biggest difference I've noticed thus far, and that is, of course, the power level. It's the elephant in the room in that they're not even close, really, not even in the same zip code. As most of you probably know, the C5 is supercharged, and it puts down about 585 horsepower to the rear tires. The LS2 and the LS3 are naturally aspirated, and so they really can't compare putting down 350 and 385 horsepower to the rear tires respectively. And numbers are one thing, but the feel behind the wheel is quite another, and here's a visual that I think will illustrate the difference in those power levels. 2, 1, go! Now don't get me wrong, the LS2 and even the LS3 put down excellent power numbers. It's just a testament to what a game changer a supercharger can be. Now if the C5 was stock, then of course the LS2's horsepower level would improve upon the C5's by about 40 to the rear tires, and that's enough to improve upon the C5 stock quarter mile time of 13.3 at 107, and that drops it all the way down to around 12.8 at 110, 111 miles per hour. That's pretty decent. The next biggest difference has to be the shifter. Stock C5 and C6 shifters are a fair bit different from each other, with most people agreeing the C6's is quite a bit more refined. My C6 came with what I now believe is a Hurst aftermarket short throw shifter, and I've got to say it feels drastically different than the slightly modified stock shifter in the C5. It's not only the knob on the Hurst shifter that's different, it has drastically shorter throws, it's much more precise, and it has a definite intentional mechanical feel to it. It's kind of like they took some of the buttery smooth characteristics that your grandma might appreciate in her 5-speed Honda Civic and replaced them with some attributes that a dedicated road racer would require. Make no mistake, it has taken quite a bit of seat time in the C6 to get used to that Hurst shifter, but I like it, enough so that I'm thinking about getting one for the C5. The next biggest difference that I've noticed is that the air filter assembly in the C6 is quite a bit different than the one that came stock in the C5. And to me, it seems like the engineers intentionally made it breathe quite a bit better. Now, you and I both know that the word seems doesn't mean diddly, and so I just happen to have a complete stock C5 air cleaner assembly, and that means we've got to take the one out of the C6 and disassemble it so we can set them down and compare them side by side. The first thing that stands out is that the C6 assembly on the left is drastically larger than the C5 assembly on the right. Taking a closer look at the air bridge, which is the part that goes over the radiator, you can see that the internal area of the C6 bridge here on top has been dramatically increased over the C5 on the bottom. Clearly, engineers spent a bunch of time finding a way to reduce the restriction of the flow through the air bridge. Taking a look at the air filter media, the C5 has quite a generous filter, no question about it. But the C6 uses 2 filters. Each one's smaller, of course, but when you add them together and lay them on top of the C5 filter media, it's definitely an increase in size. Lastly, if you look at where the air has the ability to get into the filter assembly, here's the C5, there's a small hole there, another small hole there, and a little bit bigger hole on each end, but it just looks restrictive to me. It always has. And then the C6, there's a giant hole on each side of the air bridge. And then on each end, there's another giant hole. So I think the engineers figured out they needed to open this up. Next up are the seats, and luckily the seats in the C5 and the C6 are both in pretty darn good condition, so after a few weeks of driving the C6 and then hopping into the C5 and taking it for a spin on the same type of roads, I believe I have formed a solid opinion. And as it turns out, I think I'm going to go with what I seem to recall the automotive journalists back in the day saying about the C6 seats. They're very similar to the C5 seats. They've got a little bit more support, a little bit better bolsters, but overall, they're more alike than they are different, and there's still plenty of room for improvement in future generations of the Corvette, which I think the C7s are quite a bit better, but I know for a fact that the seats in the C8 nailed it. The next thing, believe it or not, that I've noticed is, of all things, the C6 has lost some of that valuable, somewhat secure cubby storage space in the rear hatch area. I don't think it's a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination, but I gotta say, a lot of times when I'm transporting things like auto parts or whatnot that are fairly heavy, I like to stick them in the back of the C5 down low in that middle cubby area, which is actually fairly sizable. And last week when I happened to be driving the C6, I had something fairly heavy to transport. I didn't want it sliding all over the place, so I went to put it in the cubby in the rear, and it's been deleted. Upon further examination, if you take a closer look, the C6 engineers have placed the exhaust right where the cubby used to be on the C5. As it turns out, I think the engineers determined that the exhaust makes more horsepower if it's a straight shot from the middle of the car all the way straight through the back and out. And if you look at the way the exhaust is on the C5, the mufflers are directly behind the rear tires, so the exhaust comes down the middle, into the mufflers, and then it has to make a sharp U-turn and then come back and then out the back. So at the end of the day, I think the C6 engineers were thinking about the LS2, the LS3, of course, the LS7, and the power of that LS9 having to make all those funky turns, so they sacrificed my cubby. Another material change to the C6 is the way the rear differential attaches to the cradle. Engineers effectively doubled the surface area, and instead of having one rubber mount kind of in the center of the differential attaching it to the cradle like the C5 has, it now has two rubber mounts, one on each side of the differential. That gives you twice the rubber to withstand the forces that are involved when you launch the C6. Clearly this was intentional, as it took design and engineering to change that rear differential housing to be able to use two mounts. It took design changes to the subframe assembly as well. To be able to receive that extra mount, they also had to get the bean counter's approval to use one additional mount per Corvette. And clearly they wouldn't have gone through all that expense and effort if they weren't trying to solve the problem of excessive drivetrain movement / shake upon hard C6 launches. So in my view, the way that GM went about trying to tackle this problem is well done, because we as C5 owners, our approach to reducing that drivetrain movement requires the use of a harder, firmer differential mount, which works good, but it does transfer a little bit more noise and vibration from the differential into the chassis, and if you're someone who's super sensitive to that sort of thing, you might not like it.
Pardon me, would you have any Grey Poupon?
Yet another engineering change made to the C6 is moving the catalytic converters much closer to the exhaust manifolds than they are in the C5. This allows them to heat up quicker and to start working sooner. As it turns out, this approach works so well that it allows GM to ditch the secondary air injection system that you'll find on a C5. That allows them to not have to use the air pump, the tubing, and the two check valves, and there's no provisions in the exhaust manifold to receive those air tubes. I also think, unfortunately, there's a couple of downsides to having those catalytic converters so close to the exhaust manifolds on the C6. Number one, on the passenger side, it is also super close to the starter, and I think it's pretty much a proven fact that starters on a C6 are going to die a lot sooner, on average, than they would in a C5. And secondly, I think there's probably more underhood heat from those catalytic converters being up so high, almost in the engine bay really, on the C6 versus the C5. Guys, we've gotten through 7 points of comparison and we're almost at the 10-minute mark, so let's pause for now. I'll be back with more C5 versus C6 analysis soon, so subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss it. Also, please hit the thumbs up so YouTube knows to share this video, and most of all, thanks for watching.